What I really want to do is talk about the United States, excuse me, and our interest and our role. Let me just mention one thing. Earlier this year, I received a call from the Philippine consulate here in Los Angeles. This was in advance of the Sunnyland summit that occurred, the ASEAN summit. And they said, would I be interested in hosting the president of the Philippines to talk about the West Philippine Sea? And I said, of course, we'd be happy to host him. And in the end, we weren't able to work out a venue, and so the event didn't happen. But what was striking was how rarely you hear West Philippine Sea. You always hear South China Sea. And of course, Sun Tzu told us that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And in terms of the nomenclature, I think China has clearly succeeded in that. We only ever talk about the South China Sea. So what is the U.S. interest in the South China Sea? Well, the U.S. has been a Pacific power for at least a century, dating back to the acquisition of the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. Of course, the Philippines were an American colony for many decades. And also the acquisition of Hawaii, the Republic of Hawaii, at about the same time. So roughly at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. both acquired Hawaii and then acquired the Philippines. And in doing that, for the first time in a meaningful way, projected its power and its presence directly into the Western Pacific. And of course, in the many decades, the over a century since, the U.S. has never really left. And today, the United States has a troop presence in East Asia, as many of you know, of upwards of 80,000 troops, mostly concentrated in the north, in Japan, and to some degree in Korea, where the 7th Fleet sits in Japan, but spread out around. So the U.S. has always had a major military presence. We have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines dating back from 1951. And that was strengthened just a couple of years ago. The relationship has been a little rocky, but the Philippine government is much more interested in the United States and its military presence today than it used to be. One other thing to note about the United States that's maybe unique, it is unique, is the size of the U.S. Navy. So the U.S. Navy is over 400 ships. Depending on how you count, 10 to 12 aircraft carrier groups. Each group, of course, comprises a lot of ships. So the U.S. has a uniquely global Navy. The reason I'm stressing that is because that explains a lot of what the U.S. interest is in the South China Sea. So first of all, the United States government takes no position on the sovereignty claims that Professor Fu laid out for us just a few moments ago. There's no official U.S. position on who controls the islands. And Professor Fu is absolutely right to stress that the basic principle of the law of the sea has always been the land controls the water. That is absolutely correct. So who controls the land is the critical issue. There's no U.S. position on that. There are many claimants. I'm sure if we had others here, we would hear differing stories and see different evidence. But again, there's no American position on that. So the American position is really about, regardless of who controls those land features, and I'll just call them land features because they vary quite a bit, regardless of who controls them, what sorts of rights do others have in terms of transit and in terms of use of that water? Are we allowed, for example, to engage in innocent passage? What kind of freedom of navigation does the U.S. or really anybody else enjoy? And so when I mention the size and presence of the U.S. Navy, that is important because the U.S. has had a program of freedom of navigation operations dating back to the Carter administration, to the late 1970s. And there are many, many, many of these operations that occur. We never hear about them. Most of them really are not interesting. Nothing happens. Some sort of warship transits through or passes by a particular land feature. Nothing really goes on. What's unusual about what's occurred in the last 6 months, and of course going back, Clay gave us some examples from an earlier time, is the degree of tension and even conflict that's occurred around them. So I just want to stress that what the U.S. has done in the South China Sea, what the U.S. Navy has done, is not unusual for the U.S. Navy, and in that sense is not also aimed at China. Because remember that there are many claimants to these features. Taiwan, of course, claims exactly the same set of positions that we've just heard laid out by Professor Fu. You'll hear exactly the same thing if we had the effective consul general here from Taipei. Of course, the Vietnamese, the Philippines, et cetera, all have similar claims. So this isn't aimed at China per se, but of course we know geopolitically the relationship between the U.S. and China is the one that matters. There's a couple of other points I want to make. One thing that's often pointed out when it comes to what is the U.S. position vis-a-vis the South China Sea is, why is the U.S. not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS? Professor Fu laid out a few of the most significant principles for this particular case. So what does it mean that the U.S. is not a party? First of all, why are we not a party? And then second, what's the significance of that? So in terms of the why question, I'll just say that it's a quirky product of American politics and doesn't represent the position of either the U.S. Navy, which has always been strongly supportive of the Law of the Sea Treaty, and in fact has consistently argued that the United States should be a party to it, nor is it a position of the executive branch. So go back to the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration. In all of those cases, there was support for the United States to sign the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The reason it hasn't happened is because within the U.S. Senate, of course the U.S. Senate has to consent to any such treaty by a 2/3 majority. Within the U.S. Senate, there are senators who, I think for unfounded reasons, view the Law of the Sea Convention as a threat to American sovereignty, and in particular are concerned about some issues that probably are not foremost in the South China Sea, but do have some resonance. So for example, the Law of the Sea Treaty talks about the undersea mining that might occur and creates a kind of authority, what's called the Seabed Authority, to deal with the resources that would come from deep sea bed mining. And in the eyes of these senators, this is another example of a kind of centralized UN bureaucracy that will take resources and redistribute them. And so for a host of reasons, they have resisted the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though those particular provisions are relatively, I don't want to say meaningless, but they're not really the central provisions. Certainly for South China Sea, they're not their number one. There is some importance to them, but there are some other issues that are even more important. So conservatives, for example, in the US like to call, instead of UNCLOS, they call it LOST, the Law of the Sea Treaty. That's their preferred shorthand for it. And so they continue to resist it, and there's really no prospect at the moment that the U.S. will sign it. So that's simply a political fact. Now, what significance flows from that? Does it matter that the U.S. is not a party? For the most part, the answer is no, it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is the Law of the Sea Convention is a treaty that codifies pre-existing law. There are many such treaties. During the 60s and 70s and 80s, when UNCLOS was negotiated and signed, it was finalized in 1982. It was one of many such treaties that aimed at codifying areas of international law that had been traditionally understood as customary international law. Customary international law refers to the kind of international law that states develop through their practices vis-a-vis one another, not by writing them down. In a sense, like common law in the US system or in the Anglo-American system. And of course, issues around the high seas go back centuries. So this is a paradigmatic example of customary international law. So while the Law of the Sea Treaty does maybe clarify certain areas of the law, it does create some dispute settlement provisions that only apply to parties. For the most part, it simply takes pre-existing law and codifies that law. And so in practice, the US Navy treats the Law of the Sea Treaty as binding on itself in the sense of the substantive rules that it contains. So it's not a significant issue in terms of the actual practice. And in terms of the legal arguments that go back and forth between the US and many other countries, we invoke the same kinds of principles and often the same provisions that Professor Fu mentioned. So let me say a word or two about the US actions. So the USS Lassen, for example, earlier this fall, the Curtis Wilbur in January. How should we view these actions in which warships were sent through deliberately, sent through the South China Sea and, of course, within close proximity to certain of these features. And I'm calling them features because there's a factual dispute, of course, about whether they're islands or not, and we'll return to that in a moment. So first of all, under the Convention on the Law of the Sea and under traditional customary principles, warships are always permitted to engage in innocent passage, meaning they can pass through even a territorial sea, the closest part of the sea, as long as they abide by certain rules. So they can't threaten or use force, they can't spy, they can't engage in war games and so forth. If it's literally just an innocent passage, that's okay, and it always has been. In my view, the U.S. Navy has adhered to those rules. The ships that have been sent, the ones I mentioned, did not fire weapons, did not threaten to use force, did not engage in war games, were not spying. So in all senses, they were operated consistent with the principles of the law of the sea. So I don't think there's really a legal dispute over that. Now that said, if we step back and look at the politics of this, especially in the U.S.-China relationship, we of course have to recognize that China is in an unusual position in that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, there are over 70,000, over 80,000, depending on how you count, American troops in East Asia, and a network of bases and treaty alliances that could be viewed as encircling China. So if we were to flip this around and say, what would it be like if the Chinese instead operated a series of bases off of Baja California, in which they put one of their major fleets and had a huge troop presence, how would we feel here in the United States? And I think there would be quite a bit of discomfort with that. And of course, if Chinese warships were frequently transiting off the coast of California, going back and forth, we might be a little troubled by that. So I think, of course, in context, we have to recognize that the US and China are not similarly situated. We may be a Pacific power in the United States, but we don't live in Asia. China, of course, has always lived in Asia, has in many ways defined Asia. So we have to be cognizant of that perception when the United States engages in these operations. That said, I think it's important, one argument that flows from that one sometimes hears, is that the U.S. should be much more sensitive to China and really should not be pushing the issue by engaging in these freedom of navigation operations. I tend to think the opposite is true. I think when there are claims made that are overly strong and overly broad, that's precisely when you need to establish the principle of freedom of navigation and all the subsidiary principles that flow. So in that sense, I'm supportive, but it has to be done delicately and carefully. I want to close by making 2 points. So at the very end, I just want to respond to a couple of things Professor Fu said. But I think the major point I want to make is that going forward, the South China Sea is incredibly significant economically and militarily. Clay at the beginning laid out all the reasons why. But it's also significant as a test case. And it's a test case for the relationship between the US and China and between China and the rest of Asia. And in that sense, it's a test case about a rules-based order. What kind of international order do we have? And will it be one that is rules-based, in which we have agreed upon rules and principles and systems of adjudication and negotiation to address disputes within them? Or do we have a system that's more predicated on power, coercion, and military might? Of course, it's in all of our interests to have the former and not the latter. As we pointed out in the very beginning, World War II was incredibly destructive in China, more so than here, in Asia, more so than North America. No one wants to see anything remotely like that. So it's imperative that we operate carefully and think about how we might bolster a rules-based order. And that's why the arbitration that was mentioned by Professor Fu is so important. Because the arbitration, again, the U.S. does not have a position on, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, of course, but the U.S. does not have a position directly in that. Except, I think, to the degree, and here again, this is not an official line, that arbitration and rule of law processes for disputes are generally favored. We would like to see that process go forward. China, of course, has a different view in this particular case, but has often stated that it wants to support a rules-based order and will build one as much as possible. So I think over the next year or two, we will see how that plays out, and that will be extremely important, regardless of the outcome in the specific disputes at stake in that arbitration. Last thing about the substantive claims. I really haven't said anything about the legal claims that China has laid out, in part because Professor Fu laid them out so well, and in part because there were so many other things to discuss. But I just want to say that at bottom, I agree with Professor Fu that there is not clear guidance within UNCLOS on the features and the claim that China makes with the 9-dash line. What Professor Fu has laid out, the evidence that he laid out for us today, historical evidence, some of which is very interesting I'd never seen before, is important. And in UNCLOS, there is discussion about, of course, historical title and the idea that history matters. Who possesses land matters. The land, in turn, gives you control over the sea. That said, these are questions of fact. And so at bottom, this is not about lawyers arguing over what a particular provision in the very long, there's well over 100 provisions in the law of the sea, what a particular provision might say or how it should be interpreted, but really about a question of historical fact. Did China control these islands? Did other states in the region or parties in the region accept Chinese control? Those are factual questions. And I would submit that the best way to get to the bottom of factual questions is in a proceeding in which those can be unearthed and pitted against opposing forms of evidence. In other words, in some kind of legal process. So I guess the only area where I might differ, and I don't know that Professor Fu necessarily took this position, is that I think China should embrace, if it's comfortable in its position, it should embrace processes like the arbitration and any future such dispute settlement procedures. If it feels it has the best argument, it should put those arguments up against opposing arguments, and we should work this out in a rule-based fashion. So let me close with that. I look forward to hearing from the other presenters, and I want to thank Clay for having me here. Thank you.